In 1999, a person using the screen name Slave Master appeared in an internet chat room, and the message he posted would launch authorities on a winding investigation that concluded at a storage unit with two 55-gallon drums. Inside, those drums, encased in plastic and submerged in preserving agents, were the bodies of two women who had placed their faith in the wrong stranger online. But those two barrels were only the beginning of the story. The tale of John Edward Robinson starts on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois. As the third of 5 kids in what appeared to be a typical blue-collar family, his father was a machinist with a heavy drinking habit, while his mother enforced strict household rules. From all outward appearances, absolutely nothing about his upbringing suggested he would become a predator. There was no terrible abuse, no single defining trauma, not one obvious warning sign, just an average boy from an average neighborhood. Yet, from a young age, John Robinson possessed an unwavering conviction that he was more intelligent than anyone around him, coupled with a relentless drive to confirm it. During his teenage years, Robinson excelled as an Eagle Scout and sang in the church choir, cultivating an image as a model American youth. But hiding behind that clean-cut facade, something much darker was taking root. He realized he had an innate gift for manipulation, a talent for getting others to accept any persona he chose to present. By the time he was in his late teens, he was already engaging in petty scams, weaving intricate falsehoods, and twisting situations for personal benefit. He was simply a young man who learned he could lie to achieve his desires, and more tellingly, he discovered he loved the feeling. Robinson married Nancy Jo Lynch in 1964, and they went on to have 4 children. To the rest of the world, John Robinson seemed to be a dedicated family man. He presented himself in a suit for work, attended church every Sunday, and even coached his children's sports leagues. The illusion was flawless. But in private, Robinson was already maintaining a secret existence. Through the 1960s and 70s, he moved from one job to the next, consistently getting terminated for the very same offense, theft. He would embezzle company money, falsify paperwork to pose as a medical expert, and fabricate his own credentials. And this is where his behavior gets truly revealing. Robinson's thefts weren't just about the cash. They were about adopting new identities, about the excitement of pretending to be someone of consequence. He faked correspondence from high-ranking officials, invented phony awards, and even managed to persuade people that he'd been declared Man of the Year by several organizations. It was all a complete fabrication. As the 1970s drew to a close, he had been arrested numerous times for fraud, yet Robinson consistently charmed his way into lesser punishments. But in 1984, his crimes took a darker turn. Robinson had created a shell company he called Equitu, passing it off as a management consulting business. Through it, he employed a 19-year-old named Paula Godfrey as a sales agent. He informed Paula that she was being dispatched to San Antonio, Texas for professional development. On September 1st, 1984, he arrived at her parents' house to take her to catch her flight. That was the last time anyone saw Paula Godfrey. Her family would never see her alive again. Not long after Paula went missing, her parents got a typewritten letter claiming she was okay, happy, and that they had no reason to be concerned. But her parents felt something was deeply wrong. They reported their suspicions to the police, naming John Robinson as the prime suspect. But with no body and no proof of a crime, their hands were tied. Paula Godfrey's name was filed away, just one more case of a young woman who had seemingly run off. Then, in January of 1985, Robinson's focus shifted to another 19-year-old, Lisa Sterizi. Lisa had just escaped an abusive marriage and was staying at a women's shelter with Tiffany, her 4-month-old infant. Posing as John Osborne, Robinson approached Lisa, offering a program that included job training, a place to live, and everything else she could possibly need. He persuaded her to put her signature on several blank pieces of. On the 9th of January, 1985, Lisa and her baby, Tiffany, were checked into room 131 of the Roadway Inn, with the lodging having been set up by Robinson. He came for them the following day. It was the final time. Lisa Sterizi was seen alive. That same day, Lisa's family got a desperate call from her. She was sobbing, her voice filled with panic as she explained that men were forcing her to sign documents stating she was an unfit mother. Her Mother-in-law pleaded with her not to sign a thing. Then, Lisa's tone shifted. Her last words were, "Here they come now," uttered in a faint whisper just before the connection was lost, followed by nothing but dead air, the kind of quiet that signals something terrible has occurred. Just think about that for a second. A young mother, just 19, on the phone in some unknown place, coming to the horrifying realization in her last moments that she had made a fatal error in trusting this man. Mere days after Lisa was murdered, Robinson's own brother and sister-in-law, who had been struggling to adopt, were suddenly presented with a baby girl. Robinson spun them a tale about a young woman who had taken her own life in a hotel, assuring them the paperwork was all above board. He billed them $5,500 for legal expenses and handed over a set of forged adoption documents. The infant was Tiffany. She was Stare-Easy, Lisa's baby girl, the one child she would have never parted with. But for the next 15 years, she was raised under the name Heather. Robinson, having no idea that the man she called her adoptive uncle was the monster who murdered her mother and sold her off like a piece of property. In 1987, his path crossed with Catherine Clampett, a 27-year-old looking for a job. Robinson tempted her with visions of travel, fine clothes, and a much better life. By June of 1987, Catherine was gone. Her family continued to receive typed letters, but her body was never recovered. Later that year, Robinson was convicted on fraud charges and imprisoned. But even behind prison walls, Robinson's predatory mind kept scheming. He put on the act of a model inmate, securing a job in the prison's own library, which is precisely where he met Beverly Bonner, who worked as a librarian. Robinson charmed her, feeding her the same promise of a brighter future. Following Robinson's release in 1993, Beverly left her job. She informed her friends and family that she was accepting a job that involved a great deal of travel. Beverly Bonner vanished in early 1994, yet someone kept cashing her pension checks every single month, faking her signature and reducing her murder to just another stream of income. As the mid-1990s arrived, the internet began to change the world, and John Robinson found a new hunting ground in the anonymous world of online chat rooms. He built profiles on BDSM forums, portraying himself as a skilled dominant. Using the handles Slavemaster and JT, Robinson made contact in 1994 with a woman named Sheila, Faith Online. Sheila, a 45-year-old living in California, was overwhelmed with the demands of caring for her 15-year-old daughter, Debbie, who was wheelchair-bound with severe cerebral palsy. Robinson claimed to Sheila that he could secure superior medical treatment for Debbie. Boasting of his connections with top specialists, Sheila Faith put her trust in him. In 1994, both she and Debbie relocated to Kansas, after which they were never seen again. Their Social Security payments, however, both Sheila's checks and Debbie's disability money, were continuously withdrawn, month after month, for years. Robinson had ended the lives of a mother and her disabled daughter, concealed their bodies in drums, and then brazenly lived off their government aid for years. The sheer audacity, the profound cold-heartedness necessary to take the life of a teenager confined to a wheelchair, and then to financially benefit from her absence, reveals a level of evil that is difficult to comprehend. In 1997, Robinson's next target was Izabela Luica, a 19-year-old Polish immigrant and a top student at Purdue University. Izabela was not only brilliant, but also had a curiosity about the BDSM world. Robinson told Izabela that he was an affluent businessman with a global network, promising to advance her career prospects. Robinson's web of lies completely ensnared Izabela. She left Purdue, moved to Kansas, and signed over legal documents that gave Robinson power of attorney. She adopted the role of his submissive, wore a collar, and became almost completely cut off from the outside world. On August 5, 1997, Robinson took Izabela to sign paperwork for what he claimed was a brand new apartment. Witnesses observed them that day, with Izabela trailing him, obediently and trustingly, that collar a symbol of her loyalty to a man who was, at that very moment, plotting to kill her. That was the last time anyone definitively saw Izabela Luica alive. Robinson murdered her, the cause of death believed to be a hammer blow to the skull, before sealing her remains in an 85-gallon drum and storing it away like an old file. Then, in 1999, Robinson encountered Suzette Troughton through an online connection. Suzette was a 27-year-old licensed practical nurse living in Michigan. When Robinson presented her with a job as a private nurse for his elderly father, it appeared to be a perfect fit. Suzette, however, was prudent. She told her mother, Carolyn, everything about this man, JT. She provided her mother with Robinson's phone number and his physical address. Suzette journeyed to Kansas in February of 2000. She excitedly called her mother from her hotel, reporting that everything was going great. That was the last authentic conversation Carolyn would ever have with her daughter. Days later, Carolyn started getting typed letters claiming Suzette was traveling, but the phrasing felt alien. The final, damning piece of evidence, Suzette's dogs, had been discovered abandoned at a local shelter, an act Suzette would never have committed. Carolyn Troughton knew in her gut that something was terribly wrong. She began to call the Kansas City police force relentlessly, filing one report after another, giving them Robinson's name and address. She would not be dismissed, and eventually, the detectives started to pay attention. The authorities even arranged for Carolyn to place a recorded phone call to Robinson. When Carolyn conveyed her anxiety, Robinson calmly told her she had nothing to be concerned about, that Suzette was away on a boat trip somewhere, adding that it's not always easy to call from a boat. The lies flowed from him with chilling ease. By early 2000, the police had launched a full-scale investigation. They pieced together his entire method: phony companies, forged signatures, vanished women, and social security scams. They began to tail Robinson around the clock. On June 2, 2000, law enforcement executed a search warrant. Authorities executed search warrants on Robinson's residence, his storage units, and a piece of rural land he owned. On June 3rd, investigators arrived at that property, near Lacey, Kansas, where they discovered two 85-gallon chemical drums left out in the open. An awful stench reached them long before they got close to the barrels, a warning that preceded any physical contact with the containers. It was a type of smell that churned your insides, a primal signal that something deeply wrong was sealed within. The moment they forced the first barrel open, they were confronted with a scene that would undoubtedly haunt their nightmares for decades. Inside, the body of Isabella Luica had been contorted into an unnatural shape to fit within the confines of the drum. Encased in thick plastic sheets and submerged in what looked like chlorine, her face rendered unrecognizable by the years of submersion. The second container held Suzette Trin, a more recent victim, but the sight was just as ghastly. Both women had been transformed into items for storage, packed away as if Robinson intended to come back for them. 2 days later, on June 5th, the investigation led to Robinson's rented storage unit in Raymore, Missouri, where they uncovered 3 additional barrels. The first held the remains of Beverly Bonner, while the other 2 contained the bodies of Sheila Faith and her daughter, Debbie. Every victim had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, their bodies preserved in chemicals and stored away while Robinson carried on with his daily life, attending church, visiting his grandchildren, and carefully upholding his facade of a respectable man. When the team lifted Debbie Faith's small frame from the barrel, the sight forced several veteran officers to turn away. A 15-year-old girl, who had lived her entire brief life in a wheelchair and relied on others for everything, was murdered by the very individual who had sworn to provide her with care. A search of Robinson's computers uncovered a digital archive of his atrocities, including victims' identity documents, blank letterhead for forgeries, and financial statements that chronicled years of theft, along with templates for the deceptive letters he mailed to their families. The barrels offered a glimpse into Robinson's mind. He chemically treated the bodies, sealed them in drums, and put them in storage. He was unwilling to part with his victims, even in death. For him, the barrels symbolized absolute power, the ultimate form of control over women who could no longer escape his grasp. Robinson was taken into custody on June 2, 2000. Throughout his interrogation, he insisted he was innocent and alleged that the bodies had been planted, but the sheer volume of evidence against him was undeniable. In 2002, Robinson's trial began in Kansas for the killings of Suzette Troughton, Isabella Luica, and Lisa Sterzy. With the prosecution outlining a criminal history that spanned 17 years, they presented the barrels, the forged correspondence, and the financial crimes to the jury. They called Tiffany Sterzy to the stand, by then a young woman who had to face the reality that the man she once called uncle had killed her mother and sold her as if she were an object. The proceedings became the lengthiest criminal trial in the history of Kansas, concluding with the jury finding Robinson guilty on every charge. He was given a death sentence for the murders of Susette and Isabella, plus a life term for the murder of Lisa. Then, in October of 2003, to sidestep another potential death penalty in Missouri, Robinson accepted a plea agreement, conceding that authorities possessed sufficient evidence for a conviction in the killings of Paula Godfrey, Catherine Clampett, Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Debbie Faith. For these crimes, he was given consecutive life sentences. John Edward Robinson now resides on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Now, in his 80s, he is a withered old man who bears no resemblance to the cunning predator that once lured women into his deadly traps. He has never expressed any real remorse, offered any clarification about his crimes, or revealed the fates of Paula Godfrey, Catherine Clampett, and Lisa. Sterizy, the three victims whose families still lack the closure of a proper burial, Robinson carved out a dark niche for himself in the annals of crime. He became the first documented serial killer to systematically use the internet as his hunting ground, a true pioneer of predation in the digital age. Yet, what continues to fascinate criminologists isn't merely his confirmed victim count of at least 8 women. It is the incredible length of his reign of terror, over 16 years of killing, and the numerous instances where he could have, and should have, been caught but wasn't. He was terrifyingly close to getting away with everything. So close. But it all unraveled because one mother never gave up hope that her daughter was more than just a memory. One investigator chose to dig deeper, and those barrels, so carefully sealed and concealed, finally surrendered their secrets, exposing the true nature of a man who had mastered the most sinister disguise of all, the appearance of being completely ordinary. When the police finally broke through the door of her apartment in 1995, they found the old woman's hands caked in dried blood. It wasn't the blood that made the seasoned officers recoil, though. It was the overpowering stench of decay, thinly masked by burning incense. The woman who answered the police raid was holding a pair of drumsticks. These weren't the kind you find in a bucket of fried chicken. They were dowel sticks, heavy wooden mallets, used for traditional Japanese drumming, and both were coated in a crust of gore. Stained with a dark substance that authorities would later identify as human blood and tissue, 6 decaying bodies were piled inside Sachiko Eto's residence like logs, while a putrid odor had been leaking through the structure for months. But to comprehend how an apparently normal homemaker transformed into the drumstick killer, one must look back to a time before the drumming began, before the corpses started accumulating in her house. Sachiko Eto entered the world on August 21, 1947, in the very town where she would, one day, commit her heinous acts. Japan was in a period of reconstruction after the war, and by all reports, Sachiko was raised in what could only be called a conventional upbringing. There was no history of abuse, no apparent trauma. Her life was simply average. She completed her education just like her peers, finished high school, and then married a painter she had known in school, following a path taken by countless other young women in Japan during the 1960s. They began a quiet, home-centered existence. Her job was selling cosmetics while he focused on his art. Together, they raised 3 daughters. For decades, Sachiko Eto was an unremarkable person, someone you would never suspect of danger, someone you wouldn't notice. Their world began to unravel in 1990. Her husband sustained a back injury so debilitating that it left him unable to work. Rather than focusing on recovery or finding a new way forward, he fell into the grip of gambling, not a casual habit, but a full-blown addiction. It was the kind of obsession that drained their bank accounts and left behind a mountain of debt. They had just finished constructing a new house, and now they were on the verge of losing it all. The man who was once her high school sweetheart and the father of her kids had become a weight dragging them down. The conventional life she had so carefully built was disintegrating, and Sachiko could only watch as everything she'd worked for over more than 20 years of marriage fell apart. People in desperate situations often resort to desperate measures. Sachiko and her husband sought solace in faith, joining a Shinto-affiliated group named Agoniasan that focused on spiritual healing. For a couple submerged in financial ruin and despair, the idea of a miracle from a higher power must have seemed like their last remaining hope. But the Etos overstepped. They began to use the group's name without authorization, conducting their own rogue healing sessions. Once the main organization discovered this, they were excommunicated, leaving them adrift once more. Then, in 1992, Sachiko's husband vanished without a trace. His body was never located. The official explanation was that he had suffered a mental collapse and simply walked away. Yet, there were always rumors and unanswered questions that lingered, because by the time anyone began to probe deeply into the matter, Sachiko had already embarked on a much more sinister chapter of her life. She moved to a different neighborhood in Tsukagawa and underwent a total transformation. The woman who sold cosmetics was now a spiritual guide. The typical housewife had become a self-styled psychic who claimed she could heal sickness and banish evil spirits. And the most chilling detail is that people actually fell for it. She possessed an uncanny knack for spotting weakness, for pinpointing the exact words that troubled souls longed to hear. The isolated, the unwell, the hopeless. They sought her out for guidance, and she provided them with a reason to commit to her. By 1994, Sachiko was no longer just meeting with individuals. She had established what amounted to a full-blown cult, though she would have described it as a religious community. Roughly a dozen devoted followers and their relatives had taken up residence in her home, forming a commune where she presided as the ultimate spiritual guide. She professed to be a divine messenger. Some reports indicate she took it even further, declaring herself a deity. Her disciples accepted it without question. And why wouldn't they? She claimed she could peer into their very beings and expose the demons lurking within them. Only she held the ability to expel those malevolent spirits. The exorcisms were modest at first, involving chanting, ceremonies, and the constant thumping of taiko drums that could be heard by neighbors at all hours. While certain Japanese exorcism rituals can include physical components, Sachiko corrupted the idea into something monstrous. The drum mallets, once meant to strike instruments, began landing on human bodies instead, because Sachiko had concluded that the soul could only be cleansed by annihilating the vessel it inhabited, by beating the demons out, by hammering evil from the very flesh and bone. And she wasn't alone. Her 23-year-old daughter, Yuko, took part in the acts. A 45-year-old follower named Mitsuo was also involved, but her most loyal aide was a 21-year-old named Hiroshi Nomoto. He was Sachiko's lover, young enough to be her offspring, and so committed he would murder for her. The first confirmed fatality was a member of a family of 3. Mamoru Miki, a 50-year-old man, had come to Sachiko in search of a cure. With him were his wife Kazuko, 48, and their young daughter Satomi, only 18. They put their faith in Sachiko's ability to heal their problems. They trusted in her divine gifts, and that trust is what got them killed. Beginning in December of 1994, Sachiko claimed to have found demons inside the Miki family. The purification rites that ensued were not brief. They showed no pity. Sachiko and her followers bludgeoned them over and over with the heavy wooden taiko drumsticks, tools that in what should have created music instead became instruments of agonizing torment in her grasp, with sessions dragging on for hours. For days on end, the victims were made to suffer through one ritual after another, the sound of chanting hanging thick in the air while wood struck bone and flesh repeatedly. The victims endured broken bones, severe internal bleeding, and devastating organ damage. The assaults didn't stop even when they fell unconscious. When their breathing ceased, nobody summoned medical assistance. Their bodies were simply abandoned to decompose inside Sachiko's residence as she began to search for her next target. Sachiko viewed them not as people in need of compassion, but as mere objects for her to exploit and then throw away. An 18-year-old girl, Sato Miki, had her whole future waiting for her. Instead, she perished in agony, murdered by a woman who claimed to be acting on divine command, while her parents were also killed right there with her. Kazuko's sister, Kimiko Sakin, was 46 years old when she was killed by the same ritual drums. Tatsuo Ai, at 42, suffered the exact same fate. Next, Ami Senzaki, a young woman of only 27, was beaten to death in the pursuit of some twisted spiritual cleansing. Court records would later shed light on what truly drove Sachiko. It was revealed that pure jealousy was the motive behind at least one of the murders. When Sachiko came to believe that a female disciple was paying too much attention to her much younger lover, Hiroshi Nomoto, she proclaimed the woman was possessed by a malevolent fox spirit and ordered her to be beaten until she was near death. The supposed demon in another victim was their refusal to lend Sachiko money. These exorcisms had nothing to do with faith or a higher purpose. They were exercises in power and a way to get rid of anyone who challenged Sachiko's dominance or was no longer useful to her. The bodies began to pile up in her home, starting in late 1994 and continuing into 1995. 6 individuals were reduced to corpses, concealed in rooms where her other followers continued to live, pray, and believe. The stench became overpowering. The drumming never ceased. Sachiko's influence over her remaining disciples was so absolute that even as the smell of decay filled the air around them, they never once doubted her. They never tried to escape. They never alerted the authorities. This reveals the truly terrifying power of cult psychology, the capacity of a compelling figurehead to utterly reshape reality for their followers. These people coexisted in a house with decaying corpses yet remained convinced of Sachiko's divinity, still put their faith in her decisions, and still took part in her ceremonies, right up until one of them was sent to the hospital. In June of 1995, another follower was subjected to a beating, so brutal that she required professional medical care. When the hospital staff observed her injuries and pieced together parts of her account of exorcisms and a spiritual guide, alarm bells started ringing. Someone got in touch with the police. By July 5th, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to warrant a search of Sachiko's residence. The scene they walked into caused even hardened investigators to recoil in horror. They discovered 6 decomposing bodies, all in different stages of putrefaction, alongside clear signs of sustained, horrific violence. There were taiko drumsticks covered in biological evidence. And then there was Sachiko Edo herself, appearing composed and without remorse, still certain of her own godlike status, even as the handcuffs were fastened around her wrists. Her arrest created a media firestorm across Japan, a processy nation that takes great pride in its reputation for public safety and exceptionally low crime rates. The timing of the discovery made the events even more startling. Just a few months before, in March of 1995, the Om Shinrikyo cult had unleashed sarin nerve gas in the Tokyo subway, killing 13 people and injuring thousands more. Japan was still recovering from the shock of one cult-related tragedy. Suddenly, there was another cult leader, another collection of dead bodies, and one more chilling reminder that a dangerous brand of extremism was thriving in the shadows of Japanese society. During the trial, the true extent of her manipulation came to light. Sachiko's defense team contended that she was mentally unwell, plagued by delusions, and therefore had diminished responsibility for her actions. She entered a plea of not guilty, but the prosecution depicted a very different person, a woman who had cast herself as a godlike figure, who had weaponized claims of demonic possession to eliminate anyone who threatened her control, and who had expressed no guilt whatsoever, even after being taken into custody. She steadfastly maintained that her victims were possessed and that her methods had been spiritually justified. The court was not convinced. On November 16, 2001, the Fukushima District Court sided with the prosecution's request for the death penalty for Sachiko Edo. Life in prison was the sentence for her daughter, Yuko, and for Mitsuo Sakan. Her lover, Hiroshi Namoto, was given 18 years. The judge declared her offenses to be exceptionally heinous. She had exploited her absolute control over vulnerable followers, ending 6 lives through prolonged brutality disguised as religion, and had demonstrated a complete lack of genuine remorse. Sachiko filed an appeal. The Sendai High Court denied her appeal in 2005. The Supreme Court threw it out in 2008. She was now the 10th woman to be condemned to death in post-war Japan. Legal. Experts began to examine her case in parallel with Om Shinrikyo, attempting to decipher how cult-like dynamics could escalate to such horrific violence. In both situations, the same deadly formula emerged. A captivating leader who professed to have unique spiritual insight. It required susceptible believers desperate for guidance, and an isolated setting where their entire reality could be reshaped. For 17 years, Sachiko Edo was an inmate on death row, where prison staff remembered her as quiet, polite, and completely ordinary. The brutal figure who had bludgeoned followers with drumsticks had faded into an elderly woman who never caused a stir or made a single request, yet she never once showed remorse, confessed her crimes, or even recognized the humanity of the 6 individuals she had systematically broken. On the morning of September 27, 2012, at 65 years old, Sachi Koeda was executed by hanging at Miyagi Prison. She was the first woman put to death in Japan in 15 years. Her daughter, Yuko, along with Mitsuoskin, continued to serve their life sentences in prison. Hiroshi Nemoto, the young lover who killed for her to prove his affection, completed his prison term and was eventually permitted to re-enter society, forever shouldering the burden of what he had done in the name of a twisted devotion. The relatives of the Miki family, a father, a mother, and an 18-year-old daughter, who had hoped for healing but received only horror. The families of Kimiko Sakin, Tatsuri Gi, and Ami Senzaki were left without any real answers as to why their family members were murdered, because no reason could ever make sense. No logic could ever resolve the central mystery. How does a typical housewife from a conventional background devolve into a person capable of orchestrating 6 separate killings and passing it off as a divine mission? The house where the murders took place was leveled, the lot cleared, but residents still shun the location. They share the tale in hushed tones, calling her the drumstick killer. She was the woman who declared she had divine authority and then used it to beat people to death while the sound of drums filled the night. What continues to trouble the investigators and psychologists who analyzed the case is not just Sacho's actions, but how utterly normal her life seemed before it all began. She was just a regular woman who endured regular setbacks and somehow concluded that the best course of action was to proclaim herself a god, collect vulnerable followers, and execute them when they no longer served her purpose. She didn't need any special qualities herself. She just needed to find people desperate enough to believe she possessed them. Perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all, that a person who is no different from millions of others can, with the right combination of circumstances and pressures, conclude that they are above morality and behave as such. The capacity for that degree of evil does not advertise itself with clear warnings or alarms. It simply waits, silent and patient, until debt, loss, or sheer hopelessness creates an opening for the darkness to flood through. Sachiko Edo's story demonstrates a frightening aspect of our nature. Evil does not always appear evil on the surface. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged woman who sells cosmetics, raises her kids, and goes to her job every morning. Sometimes it cloaks itself in the language of spirituality and personal healing. At other times, it lies dormant for decades, festering beneath a mundane life until the conditions are perfect and the true face is finally revealed. And by the time anyone understands the monster they are facing, 6 people have already been killed. Between February 1926 and June 1927, a wave of terror swept across 2 countries, claiming at least 22 lives. Women were choked so violently that the ligatures cut deep into their skin. A 14-year-old girl was disfigured so horrifically that some officers could not stomach entering the room. Victims were discovered in trunks, behind furnaces, and shoved into bathroom stalls as the killer moved like a phantom from California to Canada, leaving a trail of victims that authorities failed to connect until it was much too late. This is the chronicle of Earl Leonard Nelson, considered America's first serial sexual murderer, the man nicknamed the Gorilla Killer and the Dark Strangler. What made him so uniquely frightening was not only his depravity, but how effortlessly he could gain a person's trust just before annihilating them. May 12, 1897, Earl Leonard Farrell was born into a life already tainted by death. His parents, Francis and James, were both dying from syphilis, a disease that was destroying their bodies and decaying their brains. Francis passed away when Earl was just 9 months old. James died 6 months after her. The toddler, not yet 2, was sent to live with his grandmother, Jenny Nelson, a Pentecostal woman whose faith was built on hellfire and retribution. She brought him up in a household where pleasure was a sin. The book of Revelation was read as a nightly routine, and harrowing biblical prophecies took the place of children's stories. The boy was unusual from the very beginning, withdrawn and fascinated by the macabre. He spoke to people who were not there, quoted scripture about beasts and harlots, and watched his cousin Rachel get undressed through cracks in the door. At the age of 7, his violent conduct, which scared other students, got him expelled from school. Then came the incident that changed everything. At 10 years old, Earl was trying to impress the neighborhood kids on his bicycle. Racing down the block, he miscalculated his timing and pedaled directly into the path of an oncoming streetcar, and the force of the impact threw him into the air. The impact of his head hitting the concrete sends a sickening crack echoing down the street. A torrent of blood gushes from a gaping wound in his temple, spilling onto the asphalt. Terrified children flee, their screams piercing the air. Medical staff would later diagnose a shattered skull. It leaves a permanent, visible depression in his head. The physicians hold out little hope for his survival. For 6 full days, Earl lingers on the edge of death, lost in a deep coma, his brain swelling against the splintered bone fragments of his cranium. Upon regaining consciousness, a core part of him is extinguished forever. The reserved child he once was has vanished. What takes his place is frenzied, erratic, and broken. He's tormented by excruciating migraines that drive him to scratch violently at his own head while crying out in agony. His recollection of the past becomes fragmented. He develops bizarre behaviors, like traversing the house on his hands or hoisting heavy furniture with his jaw. He'll depart for school dressed immaculately, only to come back wearing disgusting, tattered clothes stripped from men on the streets. His voyeuristic tendencies escalate. An obsession with religion grows to consume his every thought. He begins to recite verses about the whore of Babylon without control, his hands shaking and a feral look in his eyes. Before he even reaches adolescence, he becomes a regular presence at the brothels of the Barbary Coast. At 18, he lands in San Quentin for committing burglary. Once he's out, the cycle starts all over again. Another theft, another stint in prison, another breakout. In 1921, he gains entry to a residence on Pacific Avenue by pretending to be a plumber. Once inside, he discovers 12-year-old Mary Summers is the only one home. He attempts to sexually assault her, but she cries out for help. Her brother hears her and rushes to intervene. Nelson bolts, but his escape is short-lived. He's apprehended and institutionalized at the Napa State Hospital for the criminally insane. There, physicians make note of his reported visions, the voices he claims to hear, and his paranoid fantasies about being poisoned. However, the security at Napa is practically non-existent. Nelson simply leaves, is brought back, and then breaks out once more. By March of 1925, the hospital officially releases him while he is still at large. In effect, they had given up, unleashing a brain-damaged sexual predator prone to psychotic breaks onto an unsuspecting public with no supervision whatsoever. The tragedy that followed was all but guaranteed. His first kill would take place on a frigid February day in 1926. Clara Newman, a 60-year-old woman, owned and operated a boarding house on Pier Street in San Francisco. She was a well-off and esteemed member of the community, the type of person who prided herself on maintaining an immaculate residence. The moment she posted the room for rent notice, she unknowingly sealed her own fate. The gentleman who appeared on her doorstep seemed to be the perfect prospective lodger. He was impeccably dressed and courteous, clutching a well-thumbed Bible, and gave his name as Roger Wilson. She was delighted by his polite behavior and quiet nature as she gave him a tour of the property. Within the hour, he had vanished. What none of Clara's neighbors could have known was that her lifeless body was growing cold. In an empty apartment, she had been strangled, desecrated post-mortem, and her jewelry was missing. The authorities initially dismissed it as a simple robbery that had taken a tragic turn, a case of bad luck. They were completely unaware that they were investigating his very first victim. Nelson boards a train bound for San Jose. A fortnight goes by, yet the memory of the murder remains vivid in his thoughts, replaying constantly and nourishing some ravenous darkness within his soul. The debilitating headaches that had tormented him ever since the streetcar accident fractured his cranium were intensifying, yet they recede during the act itself. It is only in the moment of taking a life that the noise in his head finally ceases. Laura Beale, age 63, makes a fatal error when she advertises a vacant room. Once again presenting himself as Roger Wilson, Nelson shows up at her door, Bible in hand. He winds a silk cord around her throat with such force that it cuts deep into her skin, almost becoming one with her. She is his second victim. A clear pattern begins to emerge. From San Francisco to San Jose, then Santa Barbara and Oakland, Nelson drifts from one city to the next like a phantom. His fractured mind alternates between states of psychosis and moments of chilling lucidity. In the periods between murders, he is a pious individual absorbed in scripture, reciting from the book of Revelation and experiencing what he believes are prophetic visions when looking at unfamiliar faces. During the killings, he transforms into something utterly different. A creature that savors the dominance, the absolute authority, and the sight of existence fading from a person's eyes as he tightens his grip. Then, in August, there is a change. A man named Stephen Nisbet returns to his Oakland home to find it deserted. His wife, Mary, has vanished. He and his neighbors begin a frantic search, driven by a gnawing certainty that something is terribly wrong. It's a feeling deep in his core. They eventually discover her body, stuffed into the bathroom toilet, a dish towel from the kitchen tied tightly around her neck. But the horror doesn't end there, because it is far worse than just strangulation. Her head has been repeatedly slammed into the bathroom tiles with such ferocious brutality that her teeth are strewn across the floor, and blood coats nearly every surface. This attack is distinct, more vicious, more intimate. Nelson's self-restraint is eroding. The fury simmering within him now demands more than simple strangulation. It craves utter annihilation. The police take Stephen Nisbet into custody, detaining him for 2 days. Before they can establish his innocence, the actual murderer is already several states distant. His headaches have receded. The inner voice is silent once more, but only temporarily. Next is Isabel Gallegos in Stockton, then Elma Wells in San Francisco. Eyewitnesses begin to provide a consistent description of the same man, a stocky, dark-complexioned individual with disproportionately long arms and enormous hands that appeared capable of crushing a person's throat with no effort at all. His build was likened to that of a gorilla. The press latches onto this image, christening him the Gorilla Killer. He becomes known as the Dark Strangler, who preys upon California's landladies. In October, he surfaces in Portland. Here, Nelson's approach shifts, offering a chilling glimpse into the broken psyche working behind his vacant stare. Beata Withers, a 35-year-old divorcee, is attempting to support herself by managing a boarding house. It is her 15-year-old son who makes the gruesome discovery, but she isn't under a bed this time. Instead, she is found inside a large steamer trunk up in the attic, her body concealed under a pile of clothes, as if she were merely cargo destined for another location. It wasn't long before they found Virginia Grant, her body tucked away behind a furnace in an abandoned building. Then came the discovery of Mabel Fluke, hidden away in an attic's crawl space. That made 3 victims in just 3 days. His methods for concealing the bodies were becoming more sophisticated, showing a disturbing level of forethought. Nelson was deliberately hiding them to postpone their discovery, which proves that some part of his mind understood the evil of his actions. But that awareness did nothing to stop him. It couldn't. The urge was simply too powerful. The momentary peace it offered his shattered psyche far too alluring. The police in Portland began issuing public warnings. In a baffling move, a coroner's jury actually entertained the idea that Beata Withers had killed herself, a suicide inside a trunk, stowed in an attic. The sheer incompetence would be comical if the reality weren't so grim. Nelson was already on the hunt again. He wandered south toward Los Angeles. Marion Corcoran was found in San Francisco. Hannah Edmonds was discovered pushed under a bed. From there, he went to Seattle, where the wealthy widow Florence Monks became his next victim. But after Monks's death, something peculiar occurred. Nelson pocketed her jewelry, sold off a few pieces, but held on to the rest, making his way back to a Portland boarding house. He checked in under the alias Adrian Harris. Before heading to Vancouver, he gave some of the jewelry to his landlady and another woman who lived there. These were the very pieces later identified as belonging to Florence Monks. The women had unknowingly accepted trophies from a murder, handling objects that still held the warmth of a dead woman's body, and they were completely oblivious. There is something profoundly twisted about this act. It's a gesture that goes far beyond simple robbery. He was forging sick connections with these women, creating a false sense of intimacy, all while he was carrying souvenirs from those he'd murdered. On Thanksgiving of 1926, Blanche Myers was having lunch with a male acquaintance when Nelson appeared at her door. Even though the newspapers were filled with dire warnings about the Dark Strangler, she was taken in by the well-mannered man with his Bible and his story about being a lumberjack. $4 for the room sounded perfectly fair. She went back to her meal, feeling satisfied. A few hours later, she was found strangled underneath the very bed she had just rented out, with her diamond engagement ring and $8.50 missing. On this occasion, the police managed to get fingerprints from her bedpost their first piece of real forensic evidence. But Nelson was long gone, taking trains eastward, with the voices in his mind shifting between Holy Scripture and agonized screams. By December, his body count reached 14 women in 10 months. The pace of his killings was increasing. Elmira Bard was next, in Council Bluffs. Then Bonnie Pace in Kansas City. When 1927 began, something inside Nelson snapped completely. His self-control, his routine, his meticulous planning, it all began to fall apart. Philadelphia, Buffalo, and then Detroit, where on June 1st, he took the lives of 2 women in the very same building. Fannie Mae and Maureen Atry were both strangled. The cord he used on Fannie was torn from an electric lamp, while it was still plugged in. The knife they found at the location had burn marks on it, its blade damaged from the electrical current. He had stopped thinking clearly, no longer bothering with plans. He was just killing. The building's owner, Leonard Sink, found both bodies when he showed up to ask for the rent. He was now taking a life every 3 weeks, and sometimes even more quickly. At his most frenzied, he would murder 5 women in the span of just 10 days. The headaches were relentless, and his hallucinations started to blur with his waking life. Authorities across several states were finally beginning to piece together the connections. But Nelson was too quick, hopped too many trains, and used too many aliases. Just as a telegram would be delivered to one city, he would already be in the process of attacking someone in another. And then he crossed the border into Canada. This would be his last and most critical error. June 8, 1927, in Winnipeg. Nelson thumbed a ride into town. His first stop was a second-hand shop. He exchanged his clothes for a set of workers' gear and a single $1. He then went to Catherine Hill's boarding house on Smith Street. He took a room using the name Mr. Woodcoats, paying $1 up front and promising to pay $3 more on Friday. Catherine saw him as a decent, religious man. That same day, he crossed paths with 14-year-old Lola Cowan, whose father was sick with pneumonia. The family was desperate, so Lola was going door to door, selling paper flowers. No one saw their initial encounter, but somehow Nelson was able to lure the child back to his room. The horror that unfolded there is beyond imagination. After strangling Lola Cowan to death, he defiled her body with a grotesque and unparalleled savagery. When her decomposing body was found days later under his bed, even the most hardened officers stumbled out of the room, vomiting, unable to comprehend the scene. The desecration was that horrific, that monstrous. She was one of only 3 victims Nelson ever mutilated to such an extent. What pushed him to inflict this specific type of violence on this specific child? We will never have the answer. The following day, June 10th, Nelson saw another sign for a room to let. It was Emily Patterson's residence. She was cleaning by herself. Nelson said he'd do repairs on the house if she'd let him stay. Being new in Winnipeg and short on money, the offer seemed like a good one. Her neighbors saw him outside fixing the screen door. He looked so helpful, so innocuous. As soon as he was sure they were alone, he lunged at her. Emily fought back with all her might, clawing at his face until it bled. She screamed until her throat was raw, but Nelson was much stronger. He choked her with a cord. He violated her. He battered her head with a claw hammer, leaving her savaged body beneath the bed before slipping away. That evening, William Patterson returns to a silent, empty house. He moves through the rooms, calling her name and asks the neighbors, but no one has seen Emily. As night falls, he finds himself beside their bed, praying she will return safely. He feels something out of place and pulls into the light what is left of his wife. Her body is discolored, swollen, and violated, murdered while he was out. The city of Winnipeg erupts. With a second murder in 2 days, police finally concede they are hunting a single killer. A mob of 4,000 people floods the streets outside the police station, desperate for a glimpse of the captured monster. But Nelson is already long gone. He stops for a shave and haircut at a neighborhood barber shop, where the barber, Nicholas Tabor, sees dried blood matted in Nelson's hair and deep, raw scratches clawed down his face. When Tabor inquires about them, Nelson becomes hostile, warning the barber not to touch the wounds. The next day, investigators begin piecing together the killer's movements, speaking to the jeweler, a clothing merchant, and the barber. All 3 provide an identical description of the same man: a dark complexion, a stocky frame, and fresh scratches with dried blood in his hair. The description is sent to police departments across the entire region. On June 16th, in Killarney, Manitoba, a local constable spots a man fitting that description. The officers approach him cautiously, but he remains calm and cooperative, offering his name as Virgil Wilson. He claims he is just a farmer passing through. His demeanor is so composed, so rational, that the constables start to think they have the wrong person. Still, they bring him to the local jail as a precaution. That same evening, Virgil Wilson is gone. He vanishes into the night on foot, but then commits a disastrous error. He jumps aboard a southbound freight train, having no idea the train is carrying Winnipeg police officers returning from the manhunt. The next morning, an officer from Crystal City sees him near a grain elevator and arrests him again. This time, they transport him directly to the Rupert Street police station in Winnipeg. Once inside, they photograph him, take his fingerprints, record his measurements, and prepare him for lineups. They circulate his photos and prints to law enforcement agencies across America. San Francisco police wire back Nelson's file from previous arrests. The prints are a perfect match. His fingerprints align with those recovered from several crime scenes. His teeth are a match for the bite marks left on the victims' bodies. The scratches on his face are defensive wounds from Emily Patterson's final, desperate struggle. The blood in his hair is from where she tore at his scalp as she died. They request he write down his name and date of birth. He writes, Earl Nelson, born San Francisco, 1897. They have their man, yet even with forensic evidence connecting him to numerous murders across two nations, Nelson denies everything. In an interview with the Manitoba Free Press, he says plainly, I'm charged with 2 murders, but I'm not the one who did it. During his trial, a jail guard notices something unsettling. Nelson has developed a fixation on a specific passage from Proverbs, reading it repeatedly. My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. Even locked away and facing the gallows, he continues twisting scripture to justify what he's done. The jury needs only 48 minutes. They return with a guilty verdict. Judge Andrew Dart sentences Earl Leonard Nelson to be executed by hanging. Nelson simply stares at the judge, his face a blank mask showing no sign of comprehension or worry. During the weeks after his conviction, his agitation steadily increases. The day before he is set to be executed, he meets with the families of 2 of his victims, among them Lola Cowan's mother. He continues to admit to nothing. He insists the entire situation is a profound mistake. January 13th, 1928, Friday the 13th, at Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg. At 30 years old, Earl Leonard Nelson walks 13 steps up to the gallows. He has spent 2 months on death row. A noose is fitted around his neck. The rope has been precisely measured to ensure his death is instantaneous, that his neck snaps cleanly rather than leaving him to suffocate slowly. The executioner asks if he has any final words. Nelson looks over the crowd of assembled witnesses, the officers, and the victims' families who have come to see justice carried out. He states, I forgive those who have wronged me. There is no apology, no confession, and no mention of the 22 confirmed murders. The trap door opens. Nelson drops, but the drop distance was miscalculated. His neck fails to break as it was supposed to. For 11 excruciating minutes, he dangles at the end of the rope, slowly choking to death, his body twitching and convulsing as death leisurely claims him. The gorilla killer, the dark strangler, one of America's first serial sexual murderers. 22 deaths were confirmed, and at least 5 others are possibly linked to him. It was a body count that would remain unmatched for decades until even more horrific monsters emerged from the darkness. In Elephant Butte, New Mexico, a cargo trailer was baking in the desert sun, appearing like thousands of identical ones across the country. It was unremarkable, nothing special about it, just one more corrugated metal container holding someone's forgotten life. But in 1999, when authorities finally managed to pry open a corroded steel door, they found a scene that would leave a permanent scar on the minds of the most experienced lawmen. What lay beyond wasn't forgotten keepsakes or household clutter. It was a purpose-built chamber of torment, a space where insulation smothered every cry for help, where medical implements were displayed like tools on a pegboard, and where bolted chains told a story of suffering that words can barely convey. This creation belonged to David Parker Ray, and he called it his toy box. The acts committed inside that trailer across many years mark one of the most profoundly unsettling episodes in the history of American crime. A horror compounded by the reality that the full extent of his actions may forever remain a mystery. David Parker Ray entered the world on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico. Seal, his father, worked as a mechanic from Oregon. He was also a vicious drunk who brought fear to all he encountered. His mother, Nettie, eventually reached a breaking point and departed when David was just a boy, forsaking him, and his younger sister, Peggy. They were left to be brought up by their grandparents on their mother's side, Russell and Dolly Parker. The household, they survived on a tiny ranch, barely making ends meet. And although David's grandfather wasn't a drinker, he was an incredibly harsh man who controlled the household with absolute authority. But the story takes a much more sinister turn. David's father would still appear from time to time, and these visits came with presents for his son, magazines filled with sadistic imagery and severe forms of restraint. It was a father handing his own child depraved, violent content as if it were just a typical. David devoured these twisted materials, making them a part of who he was. By the time he was at Mountaineer High School, his classmates could tell there was something unsettling about him. His awkwardness around girls was so intense that it made him a constant target for ridicule. To deal with the crushing loneliness, he turned first to alcohol and later to drugs. While most teenagers were enjoying dances and football games, David was an outcast, lost in a spiraling vortex of increasingly savage daydreams that unfolded in his head with chilling precision. By the age of 14, those dark thoughts had started to become real. His sister Peggy was the one who found his artwork elaborate illustrations of women in restraints and schematics for various implements of torment. The depraved and violent photographs she stumbled upon left her so appalled that she severed all ties with her brother, creating a chasm between them that would never be bridged. But for David, stopping wasn't an option. It was an impossibility. His twisted thoughts were crystallizing into actual schemes. Much later, Ray would admit to authorities that his violent sexual urges had started at the young age of 10, but they were never confined to his imagination. They were far more than just daydreams. On July 23, 1993, Ray made a recording where he boasted, "I've been assaulting women from the moment I was old enough to pleasure myself and bind a young girl's hands." And his chilling confessions didn't stop there. He even confided in his first wife that he had taken his first life in 1957 when he was only 18 years old, revealing that he claimed to have abducted a woman, bound her to a tree, and tormented her until she died. Law enforcement was never able to prove it, but based on what would later come to light, they saw no reason to disbelieve him. David Parker Ray was far from being a haphazard, messy murderer who left behind a wake of reckless violence. His methods were deliberate, his patience was immense, and his control was a quality far more chilling than simple, chaotic savagery. Upon finishing high school, he enlisted with the United States Army, where he functioned as a general, mechanic, and was ultimately honorably discharged. In 1960, he married a woman by the name of Peggy. At just 21 years old, he was already a father of two, which included his little girl, Glenda Jean, though everyone knew her as Jessie. To the outside world, his life appeared completely ordinary, a working-class veteran carving out a life for himself in small-town New Mexico. He bounced between different mechanic gigs, becoming genuinely talented with engines and all kinds of machinery, until he finally landed a steady job working on vehicles for the New Mexico Parks Department, a role he would maintain for the rest of his free years, right up until he was caught. The job was based in Truth or Consequences, a resort community situated roughly 5 miles from Elephant Butte, and that town was home to a number of local watering holes. Ray became a regular fixture in these bars, but he wasn't there to socialize, he was there to stalk his prey. His initial marriage eventually fell apart, a second one followed, and then a third, and even a fourth. All told, he went through 4 marriages, with each one ultimately collapsing. But throughout it all, not one of his spouses ever spoke out about the terrible secrets they must have known were hidden from the world. Then, in the 1990s, Ray encountered a woman named Cindy Hendy at the local state park in Truth or Consequences, where she was employed. She was 37 and had a troubled past, actively dodging warrants from Washington state related to major theft and narcotics violations. It wasn't long before they became an item, and it didn't take long for them to realize they had a disturbing connection that set them apart from everyone else. a mutual obsession with brutal sexual desires. Their connection was forged in a shared, twisted fantasy revolving around the abduction, torment, and utter subjugation of women. The two of them egged each other on, plotting their moves side by side. And incredibly, Ray's own daughter, Jessie, was aware of her father's horrifying activities. Since at least 1986, the year she attempted to alert the FBI, Agent Doug Belden would later remember the report she filed. In it, she claimed David Parker Ray was kidnapping and tormenting women, then trafficking them to buyers across the border in Mexico. Her accusations, however, lacked the concrete details needed for the FBI to take action. This inaction allowed David Parker Ray to keep going year after year, honing his horrific craft. In the early 1980s, Ray embarked on his masterwork, transforming a cargo trailer into what he would call his toy box. This was no simple hobby. Ray poured an estimated $100,000 into it over time, methodically turning the trailer into a state-of-the-art torture chamber. $100,000. It was a chillingly deliberate investment in his depravity. To ensure his secrets remained inside, he lined the walls with thick layers of sound-dampening insulation. He then outfitted it with gynecological stirrups, which he bolted firmly to a custom-altered medical table. Directly overhead, he fastened a large mirror to the ceiling, so his captives were forced to witness every violation inflicted upon them, a calculated act of psychological warfare meant to shatter their minds and obliterate their identity. He even constructed a fur-lined coffin for confining his victims. There were custom-built wooden devices designed to hold women in bent-over, completely helpless positions. He also fitted complex locking mechanisms and pulley systems, making any attempt at escape impossible. Inside was an arsenal of torment: whips, chains, spreader bars, and clamps. He had surgical instruments, devices for electrocution, saws, and needles loaded with different narcotics, alongside instructional drawings that illustrated precise methods of causing agony. He went so far as to build his own electrical generator from scratch, specifically engineered to administer electric shocks to the people he held captive. An adjustable track lighting system was mounted above, allowing him to illuminate the person restrained on the table below. He equipped the chamber with ventilation, a power generator, and a video camera, placing it on a tripod to record every single act. Yet, Ray was not a solo operator, a fact that is perhaps the most horrifying detail of all. His partner, Cindy Hendy, was a willing accomplice in the kidnappings and torment. She was instrumental in luring, restraining, and drugging the women. Even his own daughter, Jessie, took part in at least one abduction. A friend of his, Dennis Roy, Yancey didn't just join in the abuse. He ultimately killed one of Ray's captives at his command. Several individuals were aware of what was happening. Several people took part, yet for decades, a wall of silence protected him. Ray's methodology exposes a depth of psychological cruelty that is almost impossible to fathom. He typically abducted 4 to 5 women annually, preying on sex, workers, the homeless, and those battling addiction individuals on the fringes of society whose absence was less likely to spark a major police response. He kept each woman in prison for 2 to 3 months at a time, not days, but months. Ray, along with Hendy, used a variety of tactics to capture their prey. At times, they impersonated undercover cops, forcing women into their car with a weapon. Other times, they simply offered a ride. And sometimes, it was nothing more than a brutal, violent kidnapping. Once captured, Ray would inject them with a cocktail of drugs, causing them to awaken hours later into a world of total blackness. Unable to move a muscle, suddenly the lights would flood the room. Picture coming to your senses only to discover you are completely exposed, bound to a table, and every limb is restrained. A scream catches in your throat, silenced by a gag. Your eyes dart upward, only to meet the horrified gaze of your own reflection in the mirror above. Your thoughts spiral, desperate to make sense of the nightmare. Then, a clicking sound breaks the silence, and a man's recorded voice fills the space. This particular audio recording is an artifact that haunts even seasoned FBI agents to this day. Ray created it with a singular intention in mind: to be the first thing each new captive heard the moment they woke up. His voice, unnervingly calm and steady, laid out their new reality. He informed them they were his prisoners, his possessions now, He detailed how they would be subjected to relentless sexual violation and torment. He made it clear this abuse would last for an unknown length of time. That decision, he said, was his to make later. He went on to explain that they would also be compelled to engage in sexual acts not only with him but with Cindy Hendy as well. He warned them that crying out was futile because the chamber was soundproof, cutting them off from the outside world. He assured them no rescue was coming, that their only hope for staying alive rested solely on their complete obedience. The recording continued, systematically dismantling any glimmer of hope. This was mental warfare, a prelude to the physical agony to come, engineered to break their will and extinguish any notion of fighting back. Ray then outlined his set of rules. He gave a chilling inventory of some of the tools he planned to use. He boasted that he had done this countless times in the past and was an expert at pushing the human body to its absolute limit without causing death, at least not immediately. After the tape ended, Ray would make his entrance and commence his grim work. He made sure his captives were drugged just enough to be submissive, yet fully aware. It was crucial to him that they remain conscious for the ordeal. On occasion, he would even bring his friends to join in. At other times, he would force his dogs to violate his victims while they were trapped and helpless in the wooden restraints. And sometimes, Cindy Hendy would be the one assaulting the women, as Ray documented it all on camera. This continued day in and day out, week after week, lasting for 2 to 3 months for every single woman he captured. Following this, the final phase began. The very reason he evaded capture for so many years. Ray had formulated a chemical blend of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital, two potent, hypnotic substances that rendered his victims highly suggestible and induced profound memory loss. For several days, he would keep them in a heavily sedated state, subjecting them to what he referred to as mind games, employing hypnotic persuasion to wipe away any recollection of their ordeal. As he stated on one of his tapes, "After we get completely through with you, you're going to be drugged up real heavy with a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital. By the time I get through brainwashing you, you're not going to remember a damn thing about this little adventure." Following this, he would abandon them on the shoulder of a remote highway or return them to where he had first abducted them. The women who survived would awaken with a dreadful sense that something awful had occurred. They carried the physical wounds and the deep psychological scars, but the specifics of their experience were erased, shrouded in a chemically induced haze. Many never came forward because they were unable to recount the details. Some never told a soul. This system was nearly perfect, but not all his victims succumbed to the drugs and torment, and some were never set free. Ray's own journal chronicled murders, although he refused to reveal the locations of the bodies. Cindy Hendy later claimed that Ray dismembered his fatal victims and disposed of them by burying them, sinking them in Elephant Butte Lake, or discarding them in nearby ravines. Ray himself had boasted to his associates. He explained his method was to slice them open, remove their internal organs, and load the chest cavity with cement weights before securing the body with baling wire. Authorities speculate that Ray could have assaulted, tortured, and murdered as many as 60 women over the course of his life, but they have never successfully found remains or confirmed the majority of these suspected cases. Even so, the circumstantial evidence linking Ray to certain disappearances is too strong to dismiss. Billy Ray Bowers, age 53, vanished from Phoenix, Arizona in September 1988. 1 year later, his remains were discovered in Elephant Butte Lake, wrapped in a blue tarp with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. Bowers had been raised in Phoenix, where Ray was employed as a mechanic. His colleagues described Ray as a skilled worker who frequently clashed with Bowers. During her incarceration, Cindy Hendy confessed to law enforcement that Ray had admitted to her that he killed Bowers and dumped his body in the lake. 22-year-old Jill Troyer disappeared in September 1995 after being seen at the Frontier restaurant in Albuquerque. She had been out at a bar with some friends before leaving with Jessie, Ray's daughter. Witnesses reported seeing the two of them in a heated argument. Jessie later claimed she had left Troyer at the eatery before heading to Elephant Butte with her father, but Troyer was never heard from again. Ray's personal writings included graphic entries about torturing and burying his victims, one of whom was an Asian woman whose description matched Jill Troyer's. Among Ray's belongings, investigators discovered a letter from June 1990 addressed to a young woman named Connie, sent by an Australian man named Mark. Ray's journal described Connie as being 18 years old, with long blonde hair, a birthmark on her chest, and standing about 5'3". Ray wrote that he had kidnapped and killed her in December of 1995. Despite a thorough joint investigation by the Australian Federal Police and the FBI, they were unable to identify Connie or find Mark. Her body was never recovered. In June 1999, a man fishing at Elephant Butte Lake caught an 80-pound gunny sack on his hook. It was filled with mutilated human tissue. There were no organs or bones, only flesh. The person had been systematically dismembered before being submerged in the lake. Then, in 2011, state police discovered human leg bone fragments in that same lake. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to a female, but her identity was never connected to any existing missing persons case. Ray had been carrying out these acts for decades, taking 4 or 5 women annually and holding them for 2 to 3 months at a time. The math is staggering. This pattern points to scores of potential victims, the majority of whom were either left with no memory after being drugged and released, or were murdered and disposed of in a manner calculated to prevent their discovery. But that all changed in March 1999, when a woman named Cynthia Vigil Jaramillo achieved the nearly unthinkable. She got away. Cynthia was a 22-year-old sex worker in Albuquerque when Ray and Hendy approached her, pretending to be undercover cops. They brandished a weapon and forced her into their car, driving her to Elephant Butte, where they drugged her. She later awoke inside the toy box. Ray made her listen to his introductory tape. That's when the torment started. For 3 days, Cynthia was subjected to the horrific routine Ray had spent years perfecting. But on the 3rd day, Ray made a fatal error. He needed to leave for work, as he still held down his job with the State Parks Department and meticulously maintained his public persona. He left Cindy Hendy in charge of guarding their captive. Hendy became distracted, leaving a set of keys on a table within reach. With trembling hands, Cynthia succeeded in unlocking her restraints. A brutal fight broke out the moment Hendy realized. Hendy smashed a lamp over Cynthia's head. In response, Cynthia seized an ice pick and plunged it into Hendy's neck. Cynthia then fled for her life naked, bleeding from multiple injuries, and still shackled with an iron slave collar and padlock chains. Sprinting along a dirt path in the middle of the day, she spotted a trailer and began hammering on the door, panicked that Ray might reappear. The resident who opened the door later recalled witnessing a level of pure fear in the woman's eyes she had never seen before. Cynthia was hysterical and crying uncontrollably, pleading for someone to save her, so the homeowner quickly covered her with a blanket and dialed 911. Upon their arrival, the officers who listened to Cynthia's account were doubtful, as the tale seemed too incredible to be true. However, a visit to Ray's property confirmed everything. They located the trailer, discovered the toy box inside, and realized her story was entirely accurate. This discovery launched one of the most extensive criminal inquiries New Mexico had ever seen, prompting the FBI to dispatch 100 investigators to the location. The reality of what they uncovered was more horrifying than they could have imagined, with the trailer holding more than 1,000 videocassettes, although a large number were unmarked or had been taped over repeatedly. They also found countless photos depicting women who were passed out while being tormented and violated. Among the evidence were Ray's personal journals, filled with meticulous handwriting that detailed his techniques with chillingly detached accuracy. The collection included sketches for new torture instruments he planned to construct, upgrades for his existing gear, and innovative methods for causing pain. Investigators also cataloged articles of clothing and pieces of jewelry presumed to belong to his captives. The authorities then undertook the harrowing job of trying to identify the women from the photographic and video evidence. A number of them were matched to existing missing persons cases. Several were even found still living, but with no recollection of their ordeal, confirming that the substances Ray used had been effective. However, a significant number of women captured on those tapes remain unidentified to this day. As the scope of the inquiry grew, additional survivors began to share their stories. One survivor, Angelica Montano, reported to law enforcement that Cindy Hendy had lured her to the property under the pretense of giving her a cake mix, after which she was forced into the toy box, where another victim managed to flag down an off-duty police officer explaining her ordeal but he dismissed her story and simply dropped her off at a bus station. She reported the attack to the police, but the call went nowhere. Authorities would eventually identify another survivor from a video recording made in 1996. Her name was Kelly Garrett, and she was located, still living, in Colorado. Garrett's testimony revealed that after an argument with her husband, she went to a bar to shoot some pool. That's where Jessie Ray, an acquaintance, invited her to the Blue Water Saloon, where it suspected her drink was spiked. When Jessie offered to drive her home, she took her straight to her father's trailer instead. For 2 days, Garrett suffered unimaginable torment before Ray returned her, telling her husband he'd discovered her wandering disoriented on a beach. Her husband, skeptical of her amnesia about her whereabouts, filed for a divorce, and Garrett relocated to Colorado. She never came forward because she had no idea how to explain what had happened to the police. Ray was finally taken into custody and faced numerous charges, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and torture. His accomplices, Cindy Hendy, Jessie Ray, and Dennis Yancey, were also apprehended. It turned out the FBI had interviewed Ray years earlier, back in 1989, regarding his business that produced and sold BDSM equipment. But the inquiry never led anywhere. Hendy cut a deal, agreeing to testify against Ray for a reduced sentence of 36 years. Jessie Ray was indicted on charges of kidnapping and criminal sexual assault. By pleading contest, she was handed a first 30-month sentence, followed by an extra 5 years of probation. Dennis Yancey admitted to the murder of Marie Parker and was given a 30-year sentence. The ensuing trial created a storm in the media, although the most disturbing details were kept from the public due to their extremely graphic content. A judge decided that the charges related to victims Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and Kelly Garrett would be handled in separate trials. The prosecution protested, claiming this weakened their position because the women's testimonies would have reinforced one another. Furthermore, the judge blocked a significant amount of evidence recovered from the trailer from being presented in certain trials, most notably Ray's chilling audio recording. The initial trial concerning the crimes against Kelly Garrett ended in a mistrial when 2 members of the jury declared they didn't find her testimony credible. Ray's legal team argued that the so-called torture chamber was merely an elaborate stage for his fantasies and that all encounters were consensual. However, following a retrial, Ray was found guilty on all 12 counts. Just 1 week into the trial for his crimes against Cynthia Vigil, Ray accepted a plea bargain, hoping to secure a lighter sentence for his daughter. He was ultimately sentenced in 2001 to 224 years behind bars. The survivors had all consented to the arrangement. Throughout his interrogations, Ray was eerily composed, displaying almost no emotion. He discussed his obsession with the abduction of Colleen Stan and similar sexually driven offenses with FBI profilers. When pressed by investigators about the total number of his victims, he was evasive, refusing to provide a clear answer. He appeared to find a disturbing sense of amusement in the entire situation. On May 28, 2002, Ray was transported to the Lee County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, where a police interview was scheduled. But before that questioning could even begin, David Parker Ray had a catastrophic heart attack and passed away. He was 62 years old, and in an instant, all the secrets he harbored, the actual count of his victims, who they were, and the fate of their remains were gone forever. Cindy Hendy completed her sentence and was freed on July 15, 2019. Jessie Ray served 2.5 years. Dennis Yancey was granted parole in 2011 after 11 years, but broke its terms just 3 months later and was sent back to prison, where he stayed until 2021. The infamous toy box was dismantled, cut into pieces, and discarded to stop it from turning into a gruesome collector's item, though photographs of it are still kept in evidence logs. His audio recording is secured in the FBI archives and somewhere, either at the bottom of Elephant Butte Lake or hidden beneath the New Mexico desert, there are likely secrets that will never be discovered.